Yeah, I think now the mic is working. So we shall be discussing about plagiarism. So before we go ahead and discuss plagiarism, we shall also have to understand what is copyright. Has this been discussed in the last class? What is copyright? No? It's fine. Let's just go through these slides. We shall see what is copyright, then what is plagiarism, what are the various types of plagiarism, what is similarity and is it different from plagiarism, what to do if plagiarism is detected, and most importantly for all of you, how to avoid plagiarism. For some reason. So, what is copyright? Copyright refers to the preservation of intellectual property rights in matters related to authorship. So, why is it important for young authors or prospective authors like you to understand what copyright is? First, to safeguard against inadvertent violation of copyright, because this has implications with respect to moral, ethical, and legal consequences, and also to preserve the intellectual property rights related to their own work. So, are you all aware of what are the various publication models? Was this discussed in the last class? So you can have either subscription-based models or you can have open access. All of you must have heard of open access in today's world. How many of you have not heard of open access? Is there anybody here who has not heard of open access? So I think all of you have heard this term because that's the hot term today in publishing. So subscription-based model means that you pay to subscribe or you pay per view of the article. For example, either the library subscribes to a journal and then you can access the articles of that journal, or say you're browsing an article and you find that it is based in a published in a subscription-based model, then you purchase that article for reading. Whereas open access means that these articles are freely available and can be used by anyone without paying any fees. So how that is possible? There are three mechanisms. One is platinum open access. That is, these journals would not charge any article processing charges. They are either funded by societies. For example, our journal, the Indian Journal of Rheumatology, is funded by the society. That's how we are able to make our articles open access without charging the authors. Or gold open access, that is, journals would charge authors with an article processing charge and thereafter make the article open access. Or green open access, that is, the article is published in a subscription based model, but say after an embargo period of 6 months to 1 year, you can disseminate the accepted version, not the final typeset version, the accepted version of the manuscript, you can disseminate it, or you can put it into repositories like your institutional repository or whatever. So how to identify with whom the copyright of a particular manuscript rests? If the article is published as open access, copyright rests with the authors. It could rest with the journals. It could rest with the publishers. So, for example, to identify this, we look for where this symbol C is. So here you see this article was published in an open access journal. So here copyright rests with the authors. Whereas this was published in a subscription-based journal. So the copyright rests with the publisher. So this is how you identify with whom the copyright rests. Look for this symbol C, which stands for copyright. And whatever is after that, the copyright rests with that person. Now, when you are reproducing content from copyrighted material, if you are reproducing any text, which includes sentences, passages, or paragraphs, you must always reproduce within double quotes and at the same time attribute the source of such literature. And also, if you're reproducing some figures or tables, then also you must attribute the source from where you have taken it. That is the way you can avoid copyright violation. And in fact, if the article has been published as open access, if you quote it using double quotes and give a reference to the source, then that's generally adequate. But if it's a subscription-based model, then you might have to seek permission from the copyright holder. So I'll give you an example which tells you that even if you have published a manuscript, to reproduce some part of it, you need to seek permission from the copyright holder if you have transferred your copyrights. For example, this was a article that we had published in a journal called as Autoimmunity Reviews, which is published by Elsevier. And there was this table that we had generated, synthesized ourselves. When the article was published, that time we have to sign over our rights to the journal. So the copyright rested with the journal. So a few years down the line, we produced another similar table in another journal, which was published by a different publisher. So even though the original one was our own table, still we had to seek copyright. We had to seek permission to reproduce from the original publisher because we have signed over our copyright to the original publisher. So this is to avoid any future conflict that the original journal says that you have reproduced this content without seeking due permission. So even if it's your own table, then also you need to, if it is published as open access, you can simply say that adapted from this with permission from the copyright holders. If it is published as a subscription-based, in a subscription-based journal, then you need to seek the permission of the copyright holder. Now, next question is, how do we seek the permission of the copyright holder? First is to identify the copyright holder, whether it's published open access, whether the author or the journal publisher holds copyright. And then, for example, this is another article where if you go to the bottom of the page, you find this rights and permissions. You click that, it takes you to something called as rights link, where you can actually seek permission for reproduction of content. Generally, if it's for academic purposes, without any financial interests involved, the reproduction of limited content would be free of cost. It is not going to cost you anything. But still, journals may yet ask you for money. If you are reproducing, you might have to pay money to reproduce it. So the best thing is, when you're generating figures and tables, generate your own figures and tables, don't adapt. Because if you adapt, there is a chance you may be violating copyright. Unless, of course, it's a figure or a table that you have generated yourself in the past, then you adapt with permission, but still seek due permission from the appropriate copyright holder. So for example, here, if I would choose make a selection, then it gives me these various different options. For academic purposes, generally, this would be free of cost. So you have all seen these things, duplicate publication, redundant publication, salami slicing. It was all discussed in the last class, isn't it? So let's just briefly revisit this concept. If this is the original manuscript, reproducing parts of it without duly attributing the source is plagiarism. Whereas simply reproducing this manuscript in another journal is called duplicate publication, or it may be in another language. For example, the original article might have been in Russian, but then you republish the same article in English and don't refer to the Russian article. That's called as duplicate publication. Here, this study included 10 patients. You have conducted another study where there are 15 patients, or maybe another study where there are 5 patients. These are redundant publications. They don't matter because already this information has been published. And salami slicing, when you could have one single story with the manuscript, you make it into 7 different manuscripts so that you have 7 different papers. That's called as salami slicing. So obviously, these things have to be avoided. Our focus shall be on plagiarism. So before we discuss further about plagiarism, what are the differences between plagiarism and copyright violation? Copyright violation is a legal construct, whereas plagiarism is an ethical construct. And copyright violation is determined by rules that vary from country to country, whereas the interpretation of plagiarism is more abstract, as we shall see subsequently. The offense in copyright infringement is against the copyright owner, whereas in plagiarism, it's against the author. Copying of ideas could be considered plagiarism, but cannot be considered as copyright infringement unless the idea has been published before and you can prove that. So you can avoid copyright infringement by obtaining permission from the copyright holder, and this may require financial compensation, as I have shown you. Whereas you can avoid plagiarism by giving due credit. Reproduce something within double quotes and give the reference, then you can avoid plagiarism. There are no time limits for determining plagiarism, whereas copyright has fixed time duration as determined by different local laws. So now per se coming to plagiarism. Plagiarism is an act of misappropriating others' intellectual property, including but not limited to scholarly texts, research methods, graphics, and ideas. The failure to obtain permission to reproduce previously published material and to acknowledge primary sources are the main components of plagiarism. So, two things. One is failure to obtain permission to reproduce and failure to acknowledge. So, it's best that any content that you write in a manuscript should be original. It's best that unless it's absolutely necessary, do not reproduce the language that has been used in a previous paper, because otherwise you may be accused of plagiarism. And that's a very serious accusation in today's world. So what are the various types of plagiarism? For example, this could be the original sentence. Here somebody has reframed it. This is pretty acceptable, whereas somebody might simply reproduce it. This is direct plagiarism. Somebody might take this idea and put it in the form of a figure. This is called as image plagiarism. If you replace a word or two, then this is called as find replace plagiarism. If you add it with another sentence that you have copied from somewhere else, in the hope that somebody will not identify this sentence was there in another manuscript, then that is mosaic plagiarism. Similarly, you may put some original text in between so that somebody may not identify that you have plagiarized the sentence. That's called as patchwork plagiarism. And there's something called as a 404 error plagiarism. What's a 404 error? Website not found. So this, you cite a source where actually this was not mentioned. So you are not duly attributing the source, but to make it appear that you are attributing the thing to a source, you are citing something which is wrong. So there are various types of plagiarism, and plagiarism is not simply copying text. It could be plagiarism of ideas, which are often very difficult to prove. It could be direct copying. It could be paraphragiarism, that is, you just say, for example, you're writing a review article. There is another review article published in the same area about 3 years back. You take one full paragraph, you just read that paragraph and rewrite in another language. That's also plagiarism, because when you're writing a review article, you're actually supposed to read the original articles that form the basis of the review and then write it yourself. Text recycling, you may recycle some of the text. This is a major problem when you are working in one particular area and producing papers in one particular area. You may actually end up reproducing the text from one of your previous papers. So it's a good idea to go back to, after you have finished writing the manuscript, go back and read your previous manuscripts in that area using similar methodology to ensure that you are actually not recycling text, or you are having a minimization of recycling of text. Translational plagiarism, as I said, somebody might have published an article in Russian and then publishes the same in English without saying that they have already published it in Russian. Plagiarism of graphics, this is really difficult to detect, but still you could go to Google Images and search for, put the title of the figure, and there you can still identify plagiarism of graphics if you go through the initial images. Plagiarism with citation manipulation, and compound plagiarism, that is involving multiple types of these. So what is similarity and what is plagiarism? Similarity is the degree of similarity between a given piece of text and the previously published literature. So what various softwares like Authenticate or Turnitin provide you is with similarity reports. The issue with these very powerful softwares is that they cost money. So they're feasible to use only if there is an institutional subscription. But there are free sites as well, which help you to check for similarity. The issue is that they're less powerful. Why are they less powerful? Why are these softwares powerful? Because softwares like Authenticate or Turnitin, every day they are browsing through millions of web pages and archiving that information into their database. So let's say something was published today and is taken out tomorrow. You are no more able to identify that source, but you have already copied from there. And you think that that's not going to be detected because that source is no more available. Still, Authenticate or Turnitin would have that archived in one of their databases. So it will still detect similarity to that text. So the reason why they're powerful is because they have a huge database, whereas the free sites have much smaller databases. So this is exactly what I was talking about. The database the software has access to, compare against, determines how powerful it is. So I think there must have been a discussion on predatory journals in the last session. Was there? No. Okay. Have you heard of predatory journals? How many of you have heard about predatory journals? No one. No one has heard about predatory journals. Okay. So, okay, doesn't matter. Let me introduce the concept of predatory journals. Predatory journals are those which are not available on standard databases, which actively solicit papers from you using flowery language, providing an invitation. Please submit, we'll publish it within 5 days. After they accept your article without due processes of editorial review or peer review, then they will say that, okay, your article is accepted, please pay $1,000 to have it published. So they have not beforehand declared that they're going to charge you $1,000. So now you come to realize that something is wrong. You go to your colleague, a more experienced colleague who tells you, oh, that the journal is predatory, you should not have gone there. So now you write back to the journal, I don't want to have my paper published. They say, fine, you give us $300, we'll withdraw your paper. So this is the typical modus operandi of predatory journals. They are not genuine journals. Not every journal that charges money to publish is a predatory journal, mind you. There are very many good journals that are open access, published by very many good publishers, which follow due editorial processes and don't simply take your money and publish the article. But these predatory journals, they would take your money, not initially declare that you need to pay this amount of money, not subject your article to due editorial processes or review, publish it for a fee. And if you realize that they are fake and they're not available on any good databases and you want to withdraw, then they don't allow you to withdraw. So in this context, if you were to agree to pay that $300 and get your article withdrawn, they have already published it online. So when Authenticate has trawled through the web pages for that day, it has already identified that. So even if that article is subsequently removed from the site of the predatory journal and you submit it elsewhere, it will flag up as similar, 70, 80, 90% similar. So that is the reason one must avoid submitting to predatory journals. And the message here is that even if something is not available, some web page is not available today, Authenticate or Turnitin might still have that archived in the database. So it's best not to copy from anywhere. So as we have seen, the Authenticate has a paid function. Authenticate and Turnitin are from the same company. Grammarly also has a paid plagiarism checking mechanism, but its basic grammar check functions are free. So when you're writing your papers for your or thesis, you can very well use the free grammar check function of Grammarly. In fact, I would advise you to use that. There are various other softwares as well, which are free or paid, and they have different strengths and limitations, and but the industry standard is Authenticate. So now when you subject a manuscript to Authenticate or Turnitin, it gives you a similarity report. It tells you how much content is similar. To give you an example, we shall see this in more detail later, but just to give you. So this is how a authenticate output looks like. These areas that are flagged in color are the ones that are similar. So what is the difference between similarity and plagiarism? Similarity is how much percentage similar the text is in your manuscript with reference to other sources that are available on that same database. Whereas plagiarism is duplication of content without duly attributing its source. Similarity is relatively straightforward to identify with the softwares, whereas plagiarism is difficult to identify, particularly if it's a plagiarism of figures, tables, or ideas. The gold standard for similarity depends on the breadth of coverage of the similarity checking software, whereas the gold standard for plagiarism is the source from which plagiarism has occurred. The judgment for similarity is objective because it gives you a percentage, how much similar or dissimilar the text is, whereas plagiarism is a subjective assessment based on editors and reviewers' assessment of plagiarism. A plagiarism of, if you reproduce 5% of the content from another manuscript in your own manuscript, that may be plagiarism. If you have reproduced 30% of the content, that may not yet be plagiarism. So it's not simply dependent on the percentage of what you have reproduced. So the threshold for action is arbitrary for similarity. Journals have different cutoffs. In fact, good journals would not have any cutoffs. The editor would see the similarity report and assess whether it's of significance or not. Whereas threshold for plagiarism is again based on editorial policies. Similar text may be flagged up to the authors for revision, and if it's very high, the manuscript may be rejected. Whereas plagiarism, if judged to be minor, then the content may be corrected before publication, or if it has already been published, it may be subject to an erratum or partial retraction. If it is judged to be significant enough, then the manuscript might either be rejected before it is published, or if it has already been published, it might be retracted. So there are consequences for authors if they plagiarize. And also the journal might choose to inform the author's host institution that they have plagiarized this content, and therefore due action may be taken against them. Plagiarism of graphics sometimes is difficult to identify. For example, this pathway that is operational in various immune cells. If you have a figure in a review article that you are peer reviewing that has this kind of a pathway, if you put that on Google Images, then you will get these various images. You can identify whether the content that you are reviewing has been plagiarized from some of these images. But again, it's easier to say than it's to do. It requires more experience to identify plagiarized figures or plagiarized tables. Plagiarism of ideas, again, is difficult to prove, and burden of proof often lies with the complainant. The person who is saying that their idea has been plagiarized would have to prove that how their idea was plagiarized. Can they prove that it was their idea in the first place? So that's more difficult and more abstract. Very many times you would publish your papers or you would present your papers as a conference abstract and then send it for publication. It is important that when you are submitting your manuscript for publication, you mention beforehand that this paper has been presented in so-and-so conference as a conference abstract. The reason being, your abstract and the conference abstract may be actually flagged up as double quotes plagiarized by an inexperienced editor. If they don't realize that this was simply a conference abstract that was published before. So you beforehand declare that for your own safety so that you're not unnecessarily accused of having plagiarized. What happens if plagiarism is detected? For manuscripts, it could entail rewriting the manuscript, before publication rejection or after publication retraction, or an erratum of a part of the manuscript, correction of a part of the manuscript. Of course, public shaming and expulsion of plagiarists from institutions. And the journal where you have submitted a plagiarized paper might either temporarily or permanently ban you from publishing manuscripts in that journal. Why it is important for us to understand plagiarism? Because right from the time you were in school, I'm sure you must have got highest marks if you could reproduce content verbatim. Am I right or wrong? If you could rectify things and put it exactly in the same language of the textbook, then you would get 99 out of 100. But unfortunately, science doesn't work that way. In scientific writing, it is unacceptable to reproduce verbatim. And even if you do so, you must limit it unless it's absolutely essential, put it within double quotes and duly acknowledge the source. So, because of the cultural milieu where we are brought up in, wherein from school days it is thought to be prestigious if you can mug everything from the textbook and reproduce it in the exam, that's why we are more susceptible to fall foul of plagiarism. That's essentially why all of you must be aware of what plagiarism is and avoid it in your scientific writing. So this was an analysis we conducted way back in 2017 for papers retracted from India available on PubMed. And about 60% of these papers were actually attributed, the reason for retraction was plagiarism. And this was another analysis of papers published in our specialty, wherein duplication of text, content, plagiarism, and copyright issues were responsible for quite a number of retractions. So that's why it's important for young authors to understand that they should not indulge in plagiarism, and we shall see how you can avoid falling foul of plagiarism. And in 2018, the University Grants Commission of India published a Gazette notification wherein they have actually put in guidelines as to what cutoffs are acceptable and what are not. But these are similarity cutoffs. And based on the level of similarity, they have prescribed punishments, which include either if the student is the person who is accused of plagiarism and found to have this much of similarity, then their thesis may be withdrawn or they may be expelled. And if the faculty also does that, then they're also subject to similar punishments. But the thing to understand is these are similarity cutoffs. Similarity alone does not determine plagiarism. And as I said, if your results have 5 lines that are copied verbatim from another paper in a 5,000 word paper, you have written a 5,000 word paper wherein 5 lines, 5 sentences, maybe 200 words are copied verbatim from another paper in the results section. So that is how much? 200 divided by 5,000 is 4%. This comes below 10%, but that's actually plagiarism. Whereas in a 5,000 word paper with a 1,500 word methods, 500 words or 800 words have much similarity with the previous literature. So again, that's between 10 to 40%, but that's not plagiarism because there are limited ways in which you can write the methods. So actually the decision regarding whether plagiarism has occurred or not is a subjective decision that needs to put into context what is being checked. And also the tools like Authenticator and Turnitin also have something called as a filter. If there are 8 words consecutively, then it would take that to be similar. If there are less than 8 words consecutively that are similar, it would not consider that. Because, for example, endoscopic ERCP, there are limited number of ways you can write ERCP. You have to write endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography. That's 5 words. Endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, bracket ERCP, that's 5 words. That cannot be plagiarism. But that's up to the person who's running the similarity check to have this kind of insight to understand that this is not plagiarism. Because unless you put those filters, the software would simply flag it up. These are words that have been used elsewhere. So that is the reason why these cutoffs are actually not what determine in real life if there is plagiarism or not. It is the context in which you have reproduced. So this is an example, a real life example of an authenticate output. Here you see this small paragraph of about 100 words, not even 100, probably just 100 words. You can see how much of it is similar, about 30, 35 words. And here you see the person who has plagiarized this has simply deleted 2 words in between, changed 2 words in between in the hope that the software will not detect it. but the software could even detect this. And on successive pages, you can see how much of the text has been actually taken from other sources. This sentence has been taken from somewhere else. This sentence has been taken from somewhere else. These parts have been taken from elsewhere. So this manuscript has been written basically by copying and pasting sentences from different places, modifying a few words here and there. So in this entire page, you can see all of this. Most of it is plagiarized. So this manuscript was rejected. But this serves as a good example to tell you how powerful the software is. You see here they have changed 2 words, but still the software picks it up. Here in between, they have changed 1 word here, 1 word here, 1 word here. Still the software is able to pick up that this is from source number 3. So this is very obvious plagiarism. Generally, it's not as obvious as this. So now, how can we avoid plagiarism? Make it a habit to reference everything. Everything that you read, you're asked a question in the seminar, in the word rounds, you say that this is the answer that I have read from this and this book. You make this habit of referencing everything in your manuscripts, obviously, but also in your presentations and discussions. You are less likely to plagiarize without knowing it. Use a plagiarism checking software if you have access to it, and learn to use freely available plagiarism checkers. If you are in doubt about a particular segment of a manuscript that you have written, then go and put that in Google. Copy and paste each line in Google search and see whether there is any duplicate text that's similar to it. If you are reproducing figures and tables from elsewhere, first thing is, as much as possible, avoid reproducing figures and tables from elsewhere. If you are reproducing figures and tables from elsewhere, then seek permission appropriately from the copyright holder. When you're writing a manuscript, after you have written it, read each and every line and cross-check with the original source to see if inadvertently you may have reproduced some text verbatim, because we are in that habit right from class 1 in school. So it's very difficult to get rid of that habit. So these are ways you can protect yourself. And if you have written a manuscript similar to this before, go and read the same to inadvertently avoid using identical phrases or sentences from the same. So for editors and reviewers, they must be careful to distinguish similarity from plagiarism, because not every similarity is plagiarism. And also beware intermittently changed words. In review articles, another way of identifying plagiarism is, let's say a review article has been published in a journal and you are writing another review article on that same topic a few years down the line. If you have plagiarized, the editor may find that you have actually taken the same list of references in the same order and put it in your manuscript as well. That's another way of identifying plagiarism in review articles. For images, you can check through Google Images, and for tables in review articles, you can check through tables in similar review articles published before. Journals often ask authors to provide a disclaimer that they have not copied from any source. If you have published the material previously as a conference abstract, mention that prior conference presentation, the manuscript has been presented previously in so-and-so conference, so-and-so reference, to avoid unnecessary accusation that you have plagiarized it from there. And as readers, if there are abrupt changes in tones of manuscripts, it is likely that they were copied from elsewhere. So that may indicate that this was plagiarized. So what are good practices to rewrite stuff that you have written yourself? Avoid reproducing figures and tables, and better to adapt. Even if you are wanting to reproduce a figure or table, better to adapt it, that is modify it. After seeking permission, modify it rather than simply reproduce it verbatim. And also try to make it different from the original one. So to conclude, it is important for young colleagues to understand about the menace of plagiarism. And it's also the responsibility of universities and higher education institutions to educate students and faculty, as well as provide them adequate checking mechanisms through plagiarism checking software to help them to avoid falling foul of plagiarism. So I'd like to conclude with this. Any questions are most welcome.